And bricks are over there. There's also Constitution books around if you don't have one and you would like one for free. My name is Melissa Duncan. I'm the coordinator of civic engagement here at Middlesex Community College in the Office of Student Engagement. And I welcome you to our Constitution Day event. Constitution Day and Citizens Day was designated by Congress. It's not a holiday with time off, but as a commemoration in 1952 to celebrate the signing of the Constitution in 1787. That's when it was signed, and that set forth the structure and organization of our federal government. And also the first 10 amendments became known as the Bill of Rights, also guaranteed citizens' rights. So we are going to, today we're going to start with Scott Gabriel, our professor of paralegal studies, chair of the paralegal program, who's also an attorney, is going to talk about how the First and 14th Amendments to the Constitution paved the way legally for the organization and development of unions. Just a word in, after this event, I will be doing, if you have any questions about voter registration or whether there are elections, there are some municipal elections in Massachusetts, not every community has them. You can see me after, and I also want to plug for, we have a student volunteer opportunity next Friday, Friday the 26th from 9 to 12 at the Boys and Girls Club. We're organizing a group of students to go over. So if you're interested in either of those two things, see me after. You just came in, make sure you get a piece of pizza, enjoy your lunch. And here's Scott Gabriel.
Hi everyone.
And I'm your
Here for the Constitution, right? That's why we're here today. 238 years ago today, the document that forms the foundation of our country was born. It happened in a hot Philadelphia summer. It happened in a place where people came from all corners of the country, except from the colony of Rhode Island, right, to discuss how we should go forward. It wasn't easy. We had a blank slate. In the scope of history, when you think about it, 238 years really isn't that long. When you think back to the Romans thousands of years ago. All right, we are a new nation. We're a baby amongst nations. All right, and this document was groundbreaking. It was unheard of. It had principles that you never would have expected at the time. So what is Constitution Day? It's the celebration of that document. It's also beyond the document, in that it highlights and celebrates the principles found in that document, like democracy. That was a new concept, right? Like the rule of law, another new concept. The only rule that mattered back then was the king's. Civic responsibility, working together. Those were all principles enshrined in the Constitution. As a nation, in that summer, fun fact, the Massachusetts delegation brought two gentlemen named Nathaniel Gorham and Rufus King to advocate for Massachusetts' interests. Because let's remember, each colony had its own interests. Not all of them wanted to be more than a loose confederation of states under the Articles of Confederation. The Constitution created, those who were pro-Constitution were advocating for a strong federal government. Many of the colonies didn't want that. They had to be convinced. And Nathaniel Gorham and Rufus King were two people who were pro-Constitution. Some of the more famous delegates in Philadelphia that summer, Alexander Hamilton and Ben Franklin. The two delegates that are often, the two forefathers who are often thought of as part of the constitutional movement, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, were overseas during that summer, so they were not there to attend, but they certainly were involved. So what does the Constitution do for us? It provides, as I mentioned, that overarching strong federal government. It is the concept of federalism and divided sovereignty, whereas states live under the umbrella of a strong federal government. Both in and of themselves have self-determination, the states as well as the federal government, and they must work in concert with each other at all times. An unheard of concept not found in government in that day. So not only do we have the creation of the federal government, we have the creation of the branches within. Because let's remember, those colonists, the one thing that they did not want was a king. They did not want any all-powerful entity in the American government. So to avoid that, they established three branches of the government: the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. None of which would be all-powerful. None of which would be like a king. Instead, they would work together and they would be written into the Constitution a system of checks and balances, where one branch of the government oversees another branch of the government. The legislative process is one of those checks and balances that is well known in the, or it exhibits checks and balances kind of in its most pure format. Whereas Congress passes laws, that law does not take effect until it is signed into law by the president, by the executive branch, or in the alternative, the president may veto that law. That is a classic check and balance. Also, during that hot summer, many of the delegates in Philadelphia were not in the, not only wanted there to be a centralized government and federal theory of government put forth, but they also were very concerned that that government, in its all-powerfulness, would not step on the rights of individuals. As a result, shortly after the Constitution was enacted in 1789, the Bill of Rights was passed in 1791. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. Another beautiful aspect of the Constitution is that it's a living document. There is the power to amend, because the forefathers were smart enough to understand that you don't govern in a vacuum. Right, that things change, and we know, look how much has changed in the last 200 plus years. The forefathers would never have believed what our life looks like today. They could never have predicted it. And thus, there is an amendment process in the Constitution which has allowed for the creation of additional amendments to modify the existing document. The original constitutional document was 7 articles. It's been amended 27 times, which isn't a lot in the last 200 plus years. The first 10 amendments to the Bill of Rights focused on keeping the government's hands off the people, allowing the people to be able to be free from governmental interference. How well has that worked over the last 200 plus years? You decide. You hit us? Thanks. Go more. Let's look at the First Amendment. That's the amendment that most of us are mostly familiar with, right? The First Amendment allows for 4 fundamental rights and freedoms to American citizens. Freedom of speech, the right to speak openly, to speak out against the government. Freedom of religion, the right to choose your religion, to practice your religion in the way you see fit, or not to practice. Freedom of the press, that third branch of the government, right? The fourth branch of the government that's supposed to oversee the government, supposed to discuss governmental activities. in order to keep a check and balance on the government. The press was not to be handcuffed. And the right to assemble and to petition for the advancement of rights. Free association, to gather, to protest, to speak out. A lot of these, when you think about it, are present in the growth of labor unions. A lot of these rights in the First Amendment. Because if they did not have the right to free speech, if the government could tell you to sit down and shut up, there'd be no labor movement. Let's talk about the 14th Amendment. Passed much later on. 14th Amendment contains many important clauses, but two of particular note for today. It contains the Equal Protection Clause, which makes every citizen equally entitled to the protection of law. There is no noble class. There is no class that is entitled to more protections than others. There's also the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, which applies many of these principles to the state governments. Originally, the concern was that the federal government was going to overreach. They were not so worried about the state government action. But as time went on, the states got more independent, and they began to be a concern. So the 14th Amendment incorporates the rights against the state governments as well that were contained in the Bill of Rights. Both the 14th, these clauses in both the 14th Amendment, found in the 14th Amendment, empowered federal oversight to protect individual rights and liberties against the infringement and the creation of labor unions back in the early part of the 19th century. I'm sorry, the late part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century. So the First Amendment fuels labor. It allows us to speak out. Gives us the freedom to organize, to come together, to say, we don't like our working conditions. And those in power can't say you can't say that. Those in power supposedly can't fire you for saying that. To advocate for our own rights. Labor leaders are empowered under the Constitution to speak out and to organize. And of course, the growth of protection in the workplace is so important for the workers. Our wage hours, our time off, safety protection, that all grew under the auspices of the Constitution. Now, when we're looking at the Constitution and looking at the Bill of Rights, we always have to strike a balance. The balance in constitutional provision, looking at constitutional provisions, is always looking at the rights of the individual as opposed to the rights of society. We all want to be free. We all want to have no restrictions. But we also all want to be able to walk to our cars down the street tonight in safety. So laws are necessary. Restrictions on individuals are necessary. But the Constitution strikes to balance the two, to find the place where all societal needs can be met, as well as keeping the needs of individuals in place. One of the more recent labor decisions is the Janus case. The Janus case was decided in 2017, I believe, by the United States Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the nation. The Janus decision in labor unions, those who did not wish to participate in labor unions, but yet who were included in the contracts negotiated by labor unions, were charged what was called an agency fee, which was kind of a half fee, if you will, that was about half of what union membership would cost. And that was thought to cover their representation in the contract negotiations and the benefits that they were going to benefit from under the contract that was being negotiated for the entire union. Right, collective bargaining. Well, there was a lawsuit where that concept was opposed, saying that if you don't want to be part of the union, you shouldn't have to be. Your money should not be considered, should not be automatically taken from you to support the union. That it should be a decision made by each individual. Right, so again, we're balancing the rights of the individuals and the rights of a group. Well, the Supreme Court came down on the side of the individual in this particular matter and said that there must be consent for there to be any kind of support of the union from employees. Made it difficult, right? Made it difficult for unions, cut funding, made it difficult to organize, made it difficult to encourage people to get involved because there wasn't money to support union activities. But also in many ways encouraged unions to find other ways for outreach, maybe less expensive ways. It also just sparked a lot of discussion onto the union's role in the workplace. What was free speech going to look like going forward after Janus? How were unions going to redevelop themselves? How were they going to determine where their place was now in the workplace in the 21st century? So there are two takeaways I'd like you to leave here with from today. First, the Constitution was a document of compromise amongst the citizens. Everybody who came to the table that day had different ideas of that summer. Not everybody was on the same page. Not everyone got what they wanted in the end. Compromise in society and in government is one of the most important characteristics that we can encourage. The Federalists didn't like the Anti-Federalists. The big states didn't like the little states. The Federalists didn't like the Loyalists. It was a group of special interests, all of whom came head to head and compromised. I think that lesson can be taken to our society today. We don't all think the same, but yet there's room in the middle for everybody to find common ground. The second thing I'd like you to take away is the labor union in the United States in the past 100 years has highlighted the need for civic involvement. Labor unions don't exist unless someone speaks out. Labor unions don't exist unless someone takes a chance. Labor unions don't get to protect workers unless someone says something. Getting involved is good. Getting involved at your local level, at your workplace, at a higher level, at the state level, at the federal level. All important things to take forward. So in the spirit of compromise, work together and get involved. Any of my students who are here, I have a sign-in sheet that Paula has, I believe. Oh, it's up here. Please make sure you sign in so I can give you your credit.
Thank you, Professor Gabriel. If you have questions about the Constitution or anything that he spoke about, we're gonna hold those till after our next speaker, okay?
With all the questions at once?
Yeah. And so it's my great honor to announce our next speaker. This is Professor Robert Ferrand. He is in the History Department at UMass Lowell. He teaches courses on global labor issues, labor history, immigration, and international development. When I say his resume is filled with very impressive, outstanding things, I'm not just trying to make him feel good. It is legit. He has written, 10 books? About 10 books, but hundreds of articles. He has been the editor of 3 volumes on sustainable regional development and the industrial development and decline in the Connecticut River Valley and New England. I could go on and list everything. He has been a consultant to the United Nations. He has been a consultant for several economic and social development corporations. He received the University of Massachusetts President Award for Public Service in 1998. He has a series of other awards. Personally, I think the best thing on his resume is the fact that I was his thesis student when I went to grad school at UMass. And when I say he was hands down the best professor, he was hands down the best professor. And inspired me to go on and do the work that I'm doing, and is literally the reason why I'm here teaching at the college. So I just want to say, I'm so honored that he's here and gonna speak to us. And I don't think I mentioned myself, I am Professor Stacey Hargis. I run the entrepreneurship program. And for those of you in entrepreneurship that are here for this, it's because I hope you can make the connection in your head around why entrepreneurs have a responsibility to our world, to our system of government, to understand how it works, and to think about how perhaps you can be engaged as an entrepreneur in civic activities, but also think about how whatever it is you're creating, it could be a nonprofit or a for-profit, how do you infuse this kind of thinking into what you're doing? So with that, we're gonna hear more from Bob around union work. Thank you.
I'm gonna say Stacy was the best student I ever had, because I don't see anybody else in the room now. I'm always careful when I say that, who's around. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'm gonna talk about, pretty much dovetail on what was just said for the first 25 or so minutes, and think about the Constitution, and I like the way it was phrased, the Constitution as a living document. So when the signers of the Constitution signed it and put their names on it, the idea of labor unions was not something conjured up in people's brain. I mean, there was a labor movement in the world, there were strikes, there were all sorts of efforts on the part of workers in Britain or France or wherever else in the world, probably in almost any country, workers would be unhappy with their situation and want more pay, want more respect at work, want safer work, a whole bunch of things, right? But in the US, there's no law. There isn't anything that says it's okay and it's legal to form a trade union. And so what I want to talk about is how that came about, because the Constitution in the process sometimes supports what workers are trying to do, sometimes doesn't, and some of that's a reflection of who's on the court. And we sometimes, I know when I'm talking to my students at UMass Lowell, everybody sometimes thinks, well, the law is the law. Well, no, not really. There's a lot of interpretation. And sometimes protest, sometimes the movement of people in the streets, if you will, is what makes change. And the courts reflect that. And so that's what we're going to see. And I'm going to try to do that by focusing a lot on Lowell, because Lowell, as one of the first industrial cities in America, when the new country is formed, Lowell becomes one of the first big industrial cities, places where there are factories and lots of workers concentrated in a single place, living in Lowell, working in Lowell, many of them young women, living in boarding houses with each other. And out of that comes a fair amount of conversation about work. And generally speaking, most people don't like work. I love my job, and I feel like I'm incredibly fortunate to be able to say I love my job, and I've done it for 30 years, and I can't think of any other job I would have wanted to have. Before I had that job, I was a machinist and I worked in a factory for 15 years. And I was a union organizer and a troublemaker. And the factory that I was working in at the time closed, and I went back to graduate school, got a doctorate, and then got a job at UMass Lowell, and consider myself very lucky that that's how my life sort of came about. So when I'm speaking to you now, I'm speaking as the voice of experience on a lot of different levels. One, being a machinist, working in a factory, 40 hours a week, punching a time clock, standing in front of a bunch of machines, and doing that work. And then also as a union business agent, which is a strange term, but basically it means you're the lawyer for all the workers in the factory where you work. There were 1,400 people, so every time they had a problem, they came to me. Which sometimes was great, sometimes not so great. But I got really good at arguing. I should have been an attorney because I became very good at arguing people's cases before the bosses, the managers of the factory. All right, so in Lowell, going back to, anybody recognize this by any chance? I'm gonna have a quiz. Anybody recognize where this photo was taken, perchance?
Downtown?
I heard somebody say, I think I heard somebody say it. Yes?
Downtown Lowell?
Yeah, can you tell exactly where, or do you have an idea?
Excuse me,
You're 100% right.
based on the photograph and based on what I'm gonna say, you know, even though I've been here only a few times, I think it's not that far from here. You just go out to college and just walk a few blocks from, I think over there, and you would find the exact same location where you walked on.
If you look through the trees, anybody recognize what you see when you look through the trees? Yeah.
City Hall?
Yeah. All right, this is good. See, doing this in Lowell, like people know their stuff. So that's, I was gonna say a swear word and I basically checked myself. City Hall's through the trees. Right there is St. Anne's Church. You don't quite see it. And so this is, pictures here because this is in 1912, which is obviously a long time ago. No, I was not alive. In 1912, there's a massive strike in Lowell, Massachusetts, and all the textile mills shut down because workers are demanding safer work and better pay. They can't afford to live in Lowell. They can't pay their rent, buy food, buy medicine for their children if their children are sick. They have no sick days. They have no say over the safety at work, and they have this massive strike. And this is symptomatic of what's happening in the entire country during this period of time. This is the First Amendment again, in case you forgot. You should have it memorized. I'm kidding. I don't have it memorized either, but again, the key, freedom of speech, but also the freedom of association. Complicated term maybe, but the freedom of association means we can get together and plot. We can get together and say, we don't like this. Okay, and then hopefully in the group of people complaining, somebody says, well, okay, then what do we do about it? I'm sick of listening to us complain. What are we gonna do? Right, and again, the Constitution says that's protected. The problem is employers don't necessarily agree. And so this part of the First Amendment, this part of the Constitution, is always going to be tested. Just because something says you can do it and it's okay, doesn't mean somebody might not push back and say, no, it isn't. And then part of what you have is a contest over basically who can organize, right? And sometimes somebody will have more power and they're wrong and you lose. That's just the reality. I was involved in lots of union organizing campaigns where employers did things that later the courts found illegal, but we still lost. And to try to get a do-over, you can't do that, right? When it's happened, then it's happened. So, but again, the key here is freedom of association, right, as we work our way forward. So the danger of not having voice. And some of you may know this happened, but I would say probably 90% of us in the room don't. In 1860, to show you how dangerous and hazardous work was, in 1860 in Lawrence, right up the road, a factory collapsed, full of workers. 5 o'clock in the afternoon, January 10, 1860. The reason I know this is because I did a lot of research and wrote an article about what happened, because when I learned about it, I said, that doesn't seem right or fair. 100 workers lost their lives. Most of them were under the age of 18. Some of them were as young as 10 and 11. Almost all of them were immigrants. When the building was built, it wasn't safe. It was known that it wasn't safe. It was known that from inception, it was actually literally falling apart. But the owners kept it quiet, stuffed the building with machines, ran it until one night, again, somewhat without warning, it shook a bit. There were some noises workers who made it out alive talked about, and the building fell down, and people obviously were crushed, buried alive. You know, it's just an actual incredible horror. And in the aftermath, workers tried to get legislation in Massachusetts to inspect factory buildings and make sure they were safe before they could open, and then periodically inspect them so that something like this would never happen again. The laws did not get passed. Workers organizing the way they organized, nobody told them they couldn't try to do it, but it also didn't mean just because they said they wanted it, and I think to all of us in the room, it makes perfect sense. It didn't change. So this is the kind of reason why Massachusetts eventually starts passing labor laws, starts passing laws to protect workers. Some states do this, some states don't. So the genius again, and what you heard earlier, with the Constitution, states can go ahead and do things. Somebody in Massachusetts might say, well, there can't be a minimum wage, and that case might end up in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court might say, no, Massachusetts, you can't have a state minimum wage law. That didn't happen in this instance. And Massachusetts becomes one of the first states in the United States to have a minimum wage, meaning when you start work, you can't be paid below a certain amount of money. Massachusetts now has a minimum wage higher than the federal minimum wage. The federal minimum wage, believe it or not, is $7.50, which is shameful and embarrassing, but that's what it is. So as the country industrializes, as workers are organizing, the courts are making decisions one way or another on labor activity, but there's been no real test yet of the legality or not of forming unions. It's coming. So as the 20th century progresses, lots more strikes, lots more organizing. I love this photo. I love just the look of determination, and also there's a certain amount of joy on their faces too that they're actually standing up. You can see there's kind of a smile there as they're, as they're out on strike. Strikes in Lowell are going to happen a lot during this period of time. This is a headline from a Lowell newspaper. I mean, look at that. 25,000. Imagine going out here, like if this was here now, then if this building and you all were here in 1919 and you took a break from class and you walked out to the corner of Merrimack and Bridge and you saw a parade going by of 25,000 angry workers with signs saying, we want more money, we want better work, we want safer work, we want to have unions. So that's what's happening around the country. I found this in doing research on labor history in Lowell. I thought it would be good for now because it gives you a sense, right? And ultimately they win in this instance. They don't win a union in the sense of what we think about of unions today, but they win their demand to get more money, and they win their demand to have some amount of voice at work, some amount of say over their work. The courts are going to start now looking at how they interpret the First Amendment and that sort of the collective action, engagement, voice. Should workers, this is the question the courts start to debate, should workers be able to have a say over how their workplace functions? Or is that totally up to the discretion of the owner? And the courts are gonna slowly begin to decide in this period of time that concerted activity, concerted speech, free speech, in fact does cover workers organizing themselves to try to have a say at work. They don't quite say yet, the courts don't quite say yet, something as formal as a union is constitutional, is okay. And by formal, what I mean is, so you could be at a workplace where, let's say, there's not a union at all, right? And in the day-to-day, you may to your employer say, I don't think this is fair, I've worked here longer than that person, they make more money than me, how come, right? But doing that in an individual kind of a way. Collective voice would mean we're all in the same workplace, we all go together. Right, let's go. We're gonna go see, is the president's office here?
Yeah.
Do you have something you don't like about this place? I'm kidding. I was gonna lead a walkout right now to show you what I mean, but I'm not gonna do that. But we're inching our way forward. This is the Merrimack Mills. It's a picture of the workers. I love this photo.
$3 a week.
Pardon me?
$3 a week, you're right, that's what they make.
All done.
Yeah. Well, $3 a week in that money, but it still wouldn't be very much today.
Wow.
$3 a week in 1912, right? In today's money, it probably would be a little over $100,
Yeah.
$125. And that's for probably about 50 hours a week.
And she was 12.
And she was 12.
And she was 12.
And she worked from 6 in the morning to 6 at night.
Yeah, and she's 12, thank you, I forgot that part of the story. This is from an oral history that was done several years ago. This is also Lowell. So by the 1930s, the United States and the world are in what historians call the Great Depression. The global economy has fallen apart. Every economy in the world is struggling. And the US unemployment rate in Lowell in 1933 is 40%. 40%. Workers are trying to organize, workers in the cotton mills are striking. There's another big strike in the Massachusetts mills, right over here off Bridge Street. Again, I live in Centerville and I walked this morning to come over here, and so when I walk back, I walk through history and I love it. And I try to imagine what it was like as I walk by the buildings. But this was a big political strike in Lowell. The companies, again, are resisting workers organizing. And they try to bring in replacement workers. So the workers are out on strike, they're in the street. From the Dracut side of the bridge, the Bridge Street Bridge, the Green Bridge, a caravan of cars come with replacement workers to take the jobs of the people who are on strike. What do you suppose the people on strike did?
Stop the cars.
Stop the cars, absolutely. And then they got a lawyer. They stopped the cars. And from inside of the cars, somebody had a gun. And from inside the cars, somebody shot at the strikers. And then they scurried away out of town. The next day, strikers tried to come back again. They never got into the factory. And by the next day, thousands and thousands of people in Lowell, not just the striking workers, but everybody else. Thousands of people blocked the bridge, the Bridge Street Bridge, and the police were afraid to come down the street and disperse the crowd. So a huge crowd at the corner of Bridge and Merrimack on this end, and another huge crowd right by the bridge. And the police just basically said, yeah, we're not like dealing with this. You all do whatever is gonna happen. And there was like, not a gunfight, but a fight, fists. And the strikers pushed the workers away. This is happening all over the country. This is a painting of that incident that a friend of mine did, Kate Delaney, who's an artist who lives in Lawrence. I just did a history map of Lowell and the strike features on the map, and I asked her if she could like do an original drawing of like what it might have looked like. And I think that's just like beautiful, so it's like one of my favorite things. And she captured like everything about it. But the country, I'm working my way to the end here of what I want to do. And so now, just like in Lowell, all over the country, workers are exercising their First Amendment rights. And by that I mean they're organizing more and more and more, they're engaged in strikes more, collective activity. One of the things that they start to do, which is pictured here, is actually something that was unique at the time. They start sitting in, they start occupying their workplaces. Rather than walk around outside the gates of a factory, they say, this is really stupid. If we walk around outside the gates of the factory, we can get arrested. If we walk outside the gates of the factory, people that don't like what we're doing can try to beat us up. If we walk outside the gates of the factory, all sorts of bad things can happen to us physically. So why not just stay and work? That way the people who own the factory can never operate the factory because we're sitting around, we're living in the factory. And you can see these spikes. And so in all kinds of occupations, from automobiles to steel mills to department stores, people refuse to leave work and say, we're not leaving until you recognize our union, until you bargain with us. And this happens, even again in department stores. So there's not a store like this anymore in the country. Woolworths was a famous department store in the United States for much of the 20th century, and it would be a place where you could go buy just about anything under the sun. From parakeets and goldfish to stuff you needed to sew or knit, and there was also a lunch counter where you could get, which I loved. My grandmother used to take me to one when I was a kid. I'd get a grilled cheese sandwich and a bowl of tomato soup, and I could be happy for a long time. And so these become all over the country, hundreds and hundreds, as you can see from the earlier slide. And I'm showing you this, workers lived in the factory. These are obviously the seats that they would have normally been putting inside of a car. Now they're using them to relax, read the newspaper, and their families, their wives, their children on the outside of the factory would every day bring food and sneak it through the back windows of the factory so that they would have food, right? Otherwise, in one instance, people stayed in the factory, believe it or not, for 102 days. 102 days. This led to the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, as this groundswell of organizing picked up. Franklin Roosevelt, the president, amongst other things, said, when he was campaigning for a second term, if I was a worker, I would join a union. He uttered that out loud. He didn't just think it, he said it. And to workers in the country, that was like giving them the green light. Franklin Roosevelt was trying to figure out how to help the country get going again in the midst of the Great Depression. And if the President of the United States said to people, if I was a worker, I would join a union, wow. If you need any affirmation that maybe you should do it. And he also says, right, true individual freedom can't exist without economic security. And so he's in his out loud voice, he's saying things that really give workers an incentive to mobilize. And this also leads to the Social Security Act. And this becomes the moment where labor law gets put in place. And so businesses challenge Roosevelt's thinking, businesses challenge this idea of having unions, and the federal government, Congress, passes something to support workers called the National Labor Relations Act, the NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act. The National Labor Relations Act, for the first time in the history of the United States, makes it legal for workers to form unions. And it sets up a mechanism, the National Labor Relations Board, to oversee union elections and make sure they're fair. Make sure that the business, the owner, doesn't manipulate the results. And so if you organize in a factory to have an election to see whether the majority of workers want a union, the federal government will send observers to make sure it's legal. And the National Labor Relations Act gave workers the legal right to bargain over three things: their wages, their hours of work, and their conditions of employment. All things that people had been fighting for starting in Lowell in the 1820s. Businesses, as you could well imagine, aren't thrilled. And so cases start going to the Supreme Court. And in 1937, the Supreme Court says, yep, National Labor Relations Act is constitutional. And it refers to the First and 14th Amendment in its decision. And says workers have the right to engage in what they call concerted, meaning people are getting together, concerted economic activity, and organizing is now legal. Since then, as the Janus case, as you heard before, in the earlier presentation, lots of things have chipped away, right? Employers aren't going to just say, oh God, we lost. They're going to try to say, okay, well, how do we get back some of these things that we lost through the National Labor Relations Act? And that's been the fight ever since. But codified in law, the National Labor Relations Act, at least for now, still stands as the law of the land with respect to the ability of workers to organize unions, and the First and 14th Amendment make that possible. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to help facilitate any questions that you might have, so why don't you come back up? So we'll take some questions, and I thought I would use this opportunity to put my union hat on. So I am part of the our faculty and staff union. It's called the Massachusetts Community College Council. And so this is a good opportunity for you to think about how can you become civically engaged. And I want to give you a couple thoughts. So one is to be educated, right, about what's going on, paying attention to the news. If you're interested, we have these flyers that talk about we're asking the state currently to fulfill the promise of free college. Free college is great. A lot of our students are getting access to that. We love it. The problem is that we don't have enough resources to really give what students need. And so we have a whole campaign around that. I encourage you to educate yourselves. That's an easy way to participate. A next level of participation would be wearing a button and showing that you support union work. Another way is to put your name to something. So we have a petition that's that we're gonna send to the governor, and you're welcome to sign that petition if you wanted. And then lastly, if you're interested in experiencing, like, what does it mean to assemble with a group of people who believe in what you believe in as well, you don't have to be a part of a union even, you can be a friend of a union. And so if you're interested, our union is going to City Hall soon, either next week or the week after, to ask the City Council of Lowell to put forth a public higher education resolution, basically saying that the City of Lowell supports public higher ed and wants the state to continue to fund it the way it should. So if that's something of interest to you, there are some flyers here, you can sign up and be kept up to date about that. But it's a great way to kind of experience, what's it mean? I go to the City Hall, I get to say, yes, I support my college. So that's something you can do. So I'd love to have questions. I can help facilitate any questions you might have for Professor Ferrant or Gabriel.
We've educated you all well enough.
I wasn't here for the first 20-ish minutes. Apologies for that. There was that dumb person who refused to get out the car and there was a long Uber. But what was the first 20, 25 minutes about?
I gave a brilliant presentation that talked about the United States Constitution and its form and how it started, and we missed you, and we're glad you made the second part. I'm glad you're back.
Yeah, but did you ever hear about what happened, the tragedy of what happened afterwards? Because people literally thought labor unions and labor rights were achieved in the 1920s or the 1900s with Teddy Roosevelt and all that. And history books tend to end at that, but they don't talk about 1984 Margaret Thatcher and 1981 Ronald Reagan destruction of the labor union strike. And Brookline Schools itself, despite being touted as best, taught me the biggest lie ever. Like in 6th grade, I don't even know how this makes sense, how a school that's walking top rated would not teach about the atrocities of Vanderbilt, because there was a 6th grader who was pretending to be Cornelius Vanderbilt for pretend to be a historical figure day, and when I asked him the question of why did you abuse your worker, that person didn't know what he was talking about, and this guy who was working with me actually told me to act what's on the poster board, and I don't even get how this makes
Did
sense.
you ever hear the phrase "history favors the victors"?
I know the phrase history written by victors, but the Confederacy lost the Civil War, but they wrote the history, remember that?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, that's why Brookline taught a lie while public schools in
All
Kentucky.
excellent points. Very good. Thank you for
Just
bringing
tell me
those
the truth, because it's a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot. It's 100+ years, right? 287 years since the 237 years since the Constitution, right? That's a long time, and it's a lot of history. There's some good, some bad.
Yeah, but there's a missing 100 years of how unions went to all powerful to being destroyed.
That's workshop part 2.
Yeah, next Constitution Day.
Our focus is just on the origins, because we're celebrating Constitution Day, and the Constitution gave the rights, as we talked about, speech and association, right to assemble, and that led to the development of unions. This wasn't the whole all-encompassing history
Not
of
the whole story,
the
just a part of the story, but great comment, thank you.
Any other questions? No? Well, I thank you all.
Wait, right here, we have a question.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, my English is very limited.
That's
So
okay.
I have a question about the Constitution.
Yeah.
So the part in separation between powers or check and balance, what's the guarantee we have to confirm that the powers doing the job correct?
Well, it's the fact that there are multiple people involved in checks and balances, and you hope that that some of them will make that judgment. And if there's an argument as to what's right, because what's right sometimes depends on who's looking at it.
Yeah.
The arguments about what's right end up where? In which branch? In the judicial branch, right?
Yeah.
And then they make their way through the system to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is the final arbiter under the Supremacy Clause.
Do you wanna add anything? I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Some of it again comes back to the same way as in what I was saying about where the unions came from. Because this is my take on the history, that simply because it says in the Constitution, this is the way it's supposed to be, doesn't necessarily mean that's actually the way it happens.
Yeah.
And so then the answer to your question is whether or not we the people
That's correct.
say, wait, no, you're wrong, right? I mean, so with the case of unions, so here's a very specific example of what I mean. In the late 19th century, the Supreme Court took a civil rights case. It was a case on segregation. In the United States in the late 19th century, lots of institutions, particularly in the American South, were segregated on the basis of race. And so it was a case worked its way through the lower courts, federal courts, got to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said separate but equal in public transportation, public accommodations is constitutional.
Plessy versus Ferguson.
Plessy versus Ferguson, right. And so that stood on the books as okay.
Yeah.
So segregation's okay. By the 1950s, the civil rights movement in America is mobilizing against segregation in public education, public higher education, transportation, access to employment, all these things, right? And so there's mass protests in America. There are bus boycotts, there are school boycotts, there are parents filing lawsuits saying their kids aren't getting a fair education. And Brown v. Board of Education becomes one of the most famous, to me anyway, one of the most famous Supreme Court cases in the country. And Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 says separate but equal is unconstitutional. So here you have in 1896, segregation's cool with the Constitution, and 80 or so years later, 60 or so years later, partly I think because of protest. If the civil rights movement hadn't been organized and advocating, again, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to advocate, if they had not been doing that, there would have been no reason necessarily for an entirely different Supreme Court, different group of people, right, to say, no, that doesn't make any sense, that was a bad ruling, right? So the fact that, the separation of powers, I think, is like, again, a genius of the original document. But you still have to have some level of engagement. We, the people, can't think that just because it says that necessarily is gonna get carried out the way that it ought to. People have to be vigilant, people have to pay attention. It's easy for us to lose our rights if we're not paying attention. And again, not everybody, when Brown v. Board of Education passed, now states were supposed to desegregate their schools, but they didn't. Even though the Supreme Court said, okay, this is wrong, you have to change, the states basically said, you can't tell us what to do. And they resisted. At one point, the federal government actually sent federal troops, the military, to a college campus in Mississippi.
That's the point.
Pardon?
Yeah, that's the point more interesting in the case.
Yeah.
And just to add on to that, what's your name?
Mohammed?
Mohammed. The cautionary tale is that if we're not paying attention, we cannot assume the checks and balances are happening on their own. We cannot assume that the judicial branch will do what it's supposed to, and it's up to you and me, right? It's up to each of us to participate. The day I was born here in the US, so the day I turned 18, I went and registered to vote, because I knew that was my first step in being able to have a say in my community, in my state, in my country. And so, that's the first step. And then it's being aware, paying attention, and being with others to know that when you see something, say something that's not right for others, and valuing those core parts of the Constitution. For me, you might think it's freedom of speech is like my favorite, but it's actually freedom of religion. Because for me, I am not religious. I don't want religion forced on me. And I want everyone to be able to practice their religion. So that to me is the core of why I've always been I have my Constitution still from my 8th grade class where we wrote notes about it. Like, I've just always valued it. Because I understand they take one right away, they can take them all. And so I pay attention.
Slippery slope.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Wasn't it National Voter Day yesterday?
Yesterday's National Voter Registration, you can register to vote up until the end of October. Even though there aren't a lot of municipal elections this year, and I know I've even looked at a lot of people on school committees are running unopposed, but I can tell you if there's one in your town, because there's a list in the state. There's going to be a lot of elections next year. It's gonna be state legislature, congressional, state governor, and there are going to be ballot initiatives that affect everyone who lives in the state. They're still working out what those are. So you can register. The other thing I'd like to encourage you to do is stay informed. That's how you know what's going on. Objective news can be hard to find, but there are some sources free online, AP News, Reuters, BBC, NPR, that don't have paywalls. It's a lot of the good.
And with your Middlesex, you can get access to newsletters.
Some news,
With your
yeah, and like the
library.
Atlantic and the Flipster. If you look on Flipster, go talk to the librarian. So, thank you for coming. If you have any ideas for future things.
There's goodies
talk to
over
me.
there.
Enough.
Oh, you have some?
Constitution books and handouts, take a piece of pizza on your way
I just
out.
have one question.
Yes.
It's kind of related to this, kind of off a little bit, but your shirt,
Yeah,
fair pay for community college
Yes.
educators,
yes.
is that a movement that's happening now?
That's happening right now. That's all related to the free college. We don't have enough resources. We're asking the state
If
for
community
more
college is free, because I'm
resources.
able to register, they say if you register for 6th grade, it's free automatically, but explain what's the difference between what we have now versus this one.
It is free college, it is that.
Continuing free college, continuing to be able
We
to
wanna make
pay
sure
for
the
it.
governor continues to fund free college and we want all the resources. It is our current
It's more than
campaign.
yes, you need the resources.
And they're not to get too data driven, but Massachusetts is the most expensive state to live. Who agrees? It's actually fact. We are number 2 behind Hawaii. Okay, California is 3rd. California community college professors earn 70% more than we do. 70% more. They can afford to live in their state. We can't. So that's the other reason what this is about. That's what this is about.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you.